It's 9 o'clock and you're watching a Sky News special programme, Quincy Floyd and Neville Lawrence, The Fight for Justice. Tonight we have an exclusive interview with George Floyd's son Quincy, who says he can't stop watching the video of his father's final minutes, those 8 minutes and 46 seconds under the knee of a white police officer in Minneapolis in May this year. George's death led to a reckoning in race relations in the US and around the world as hundreds of thousands of people joined Black Lives Matter protests. In a special report, as part of our coverage of Black History Month, we brought Quincy together with Neville Lawrence, whose son Stephen was murdered in a racist attack in London in April 1993. Stephen's murder marked the start of significant change in race relations in the UK and led to the Macpherson report labelling the Metropolitan Police as institutionally racist. Tonight we'll be discussing the ongoing fight for racial justice both here and in the US. Plus, we'll be asking how much has really changed since George Floyd's death in May and finding out what lessons still need to be learned. And later, we'll be joined by George Floyd's high school friend, Cyril White. But first, Sky's Noel Phillips has this exclusive interview with George Floyd's son, Quincy.
Kneeling on the street in Minneapolis, where his father, George Floyd, took his last breath, is a pain that is deeply personal for his eldest son, Quincy. His father was killed when a police officer knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
I can't stop watching the video. I watch the video almost over and over. Not every day, but every now and then I just think about it.
It's the sort of grief Neville Lawrence knows all too well. We've brought the two men together for the first time.
When I saw the incident with your dad being kneeling on the floor with that man, kneeling on his neck, and the other officers around standing and watching, tears came out my eyes.
Like George Floyd, Stephen Lawrence's racist killing 27 years ago has left an indelible mark in British society.
How did you get through the tragedy of what happened to your son?
We had to go into counseling. The whole family had to go into counseling and talk about it. Even now, really right now, you know, if I went to a funeral to see somebody being buried, I can't go near, when they're putting the coffin down, I can't go near it because I'm looking and thinking that I'm reburying Stephen again.
Amazing grace.
In the aftermath of his death, America was left in turmoil. George Floyd's name echoed across the world. I remember watching your dad's funeral on TV and seeing just how emotional and just how raw it was for your family. Can you describe what it was like for you?
It's like you see him breathing. My knees just kind of buckled. I kiss him in the forehead and let him know that everything's going to be all right. Your son's going to be here with you. Your family's here with you. You're not going to go out in vain. And we went to go bury him.
Quincy now drives the Cadillac which George Floyd once owned. He's also launched a memorial project in his hometown to honour his dad's legacy. What is it like for you when you hear those words, "I can't breathe"?
The knee on his neck saying he couldn't breathe and he called out for mama. Yeah, it's devastating. And I have chills just thinking about what he was saying.
It's not going to be very easy. And for all the years that I've been struggling, it hasn't been easy, but you have to have a aim in view. And the aim in view of my family was to try and get justice. It took us a long time, but eventually we got some justice. And you can't give up. You know, you got to keep fighting.
In 2012, two men were finally jailed for life for the racist murder of Neville's son.
I have a hard time trusting any cops right about now. I'm not saying all cops are bad cops. All cops are not good cops. But sitting there to my father, devastated me, did not trust any cop.
George Floyd's death was a painful reminder of America's troubled history of racism and police brutality. 3,000 miles apart, these two men are united in their fight, demanding nothing less than racial justice. Noel Phillips, Sky News.
Well, let's discuss that ongoing fight for justice now. And at the heart of it is the relationship between black and ethnic minority communities and the police. Joining me now are Diane Abbott, former Shadow Home Secretary and Britain's first black female MP. In a moment, we'll be speaking to Francoise Jones, former president of the National Black Police Association, and Dr. Christine Callender from University College London's Institute of Education. Many thanks indeed for joining us this evening. Diane Abbott, if I could firstly start with you. You represent a constituency that is perhaps one of London's most diverse constituencies. The death of George Floyd in many ways has shone a light on race relations here in the United Kingdom. How would you describe that relationship between the police and the communities they serve?
Well, my constituency is very diverse and I'm very proud of that. In terms of relationships between the community and the police, I have to say that the figures don't lie. And black people are more likely to be stopped and searched, more likely to be handcuffed, or even more likely to be fined under the coronavirus regulations. So there is still an issue, just as there was at the time of Stephen Lawrence's death, about disproportionate use of police powers against people of colour.
And why do you think that is? Because most people would say that the vast majority of police officers are good officers. They get up every single day to do a good job and serve the communities that they cover. So why are you seeing this disproportionate impact on largely young black men up and down the country?
Well, I mean, you have a police officer on the panel and she's better able to tell you than I am. I'm not saying the vast majority of police officers are bad people, but I'm saying the figures do not lie. And there's no question that it hasn't helped relationships between the police and the community.
Dr. Callender, again, many would say that this is a problem that's exclusively not about the police. We need to look at all our institutions across society. Do we need to have a hard look at ourselves?
We do, because no matter what metric we look at, if you look at housing, if you look at employment, education, criminal justice system, as Diane just mentioned, health, no matter where we look, we are seeing vast discrepancies between the outcomes for black people in this country and everyone else.
And how would you explain that? Why is that? I mean, many would say Britain is not a racist country, it's not a racist society. So why are we seeing these disparities?
I think we really need to start unravelling this conversation, because what all of these various areas where we see disproportionality show is that socioeconomic status has a significant impact on health outcomes, on educational outcomes, on likelihood to be involved in criminal justice system and so on. So whatever analyses we use, we have to always come back to the significance of socioeconomic status. And as a community, we are located in the lower echelons of that criteria.
Diane Abbott, would you agree with that? This is largely about socioeconomic status?
It's partly about class, but that doesn't explain why black working class young men are more likely to be stopped and searched than white working class men. There is no question. I mean, most police officers are good guys and so on, but some of them do approach people of colour with certain preconceptions. Do you remember my colleague, Dawn Butler, who was stopped? She was in, I think, quite a nice car with a black male, and she was stopped by the police. They just assumed that two black people in a nice car must be up to no good.
Dr. Callender, you spoke about unravelling this conversation. So where do we start?
Well, I think we already have a lot of information at our disposal. There have been various reports that have come out since COVID and even before that. So we actually know what some of the issues are. Where I think we haven't been very proactive is actually acting on the many, many recommendations that have been made by various reports. We seem to want to continue a rather circular conversation, but actually we now need to actually make some action and actually look at what this data is telling us and do something about it.
Diane Abbott, Dr. Callender there picked up on the point of COVID. Do you think this is once again an example of the disparities that exist in society? We've seen the figures, or the latest figures regarding this pandemic, and how it is largely affecting those from an ethno-minority background.
Yes, I mean, when we went into lockdown and COVID was on the rise, it was horrifying. Day after day, you would see photographs on the front page of the newspapers of NHS workers that had died, and the majority of those workers were Black minority ethnic. I think of the first 23 doctors that died, 22 were Black minority ethnic. It reminded us of the enormous service that Black minority ethnic people, how they serve in the public sector and in the NHS, but it also reminded us of how vulnerable we are.
Dr. Callender, you've spoken in the past about us needing culturally competent organisations. I'm interested to know what you meant by that and how all of us can apply that in the institutions where we work.
Well, it's quite clear that for a lot of our public services, that when it comes to people from Black and minority ethnic groups, their needs aren't being served in a way that is equitable. So there's something there about the institutions. This is not about the people, this is about the institutions. And I think we all need to look very carefully at our hidden biases and assumptions that we may be, some of these biases we may be aware of and some we may not, but we do need to look organisationally at whether the offer that we have to all of our communities is serving each of them in an equitable way. So I think a great deal of introspection and asking ourselves some very difficult questions and facing some realities is in order.
Diane Abbott?
People do make assumptions based on race. I mean, we were talking about coronavirus and people arrested under the coronavirus legislation. Some of these people were Black men who happen to be NHS workers on their way to work. We have to be willing to examine our preconceptions about other communities. I think, actually, younger people who are more likely to have gone to school alongside Black people, gone to uni, they are less likely quite often to have those preconceptions. There's too many people in our public services who've never had to examine their unconscious bias.
Dr. Callender, what is your position on this issue of stop and search? It is a subject that we've been speaking a lot about in recent years. From your point of view, is there a place for it? Does stop and search work, or is there a danger that you alienate some sectors of society, again, predominantly young Black men?
Well, I'm old enough to remember its predecessor, the sus laws. And I think stop and search, unfortunately, is operating in a kind of similar way. I take on board the issues within our community with crime, and it's important to tackle that. But when we look at the kind of turnover rate in terms of stop and search and whether or not it leads to a prosecution, we can see that in a lot of cases that the percentages don't work. Actually, we have, I think in London, was it 25% of young Black men had been stopped and searched. We have to find another way of using the local intelligence we have so that those people who are going about their day-to-day business do not feel that they have to constantly be aware or alert to the possibility that they will be stopped and searched by the police.
We're going to bring in Francoise Jones, a former president of the National Black Police Association. Thank you for joining us, Francine. On that point of stop and search, what is your view? Do you think that there is a place for it? Because this debate has been going on for a number of years now about whether it alienates, isolates certain groups in society. What do you make of it? A couple of sound issues there with Francine. Francine, we will try and re-establish the link with you. Diane Abbott, I mean, what are your thoughts? A place for stop and search in the country?
Of course there's a place for stop and search, but that is evidence-based stop and search. I don't think anybody argues if the police have specific evidence, they shouldn't be able to stop somebody and search someone. What has poisoned relationships with the community is random stop and search. The Brixton riots in the early 80s was caused by a mass stop and search operation. I think it was called Operation Swamp. So if there's the evidence, that's one thing. But if you are just picking out people at random, whether they're young black men or even increasingly nowadays young Muslims, that is bound to poison relationships. And what we find with that random stop and search, that the most thing that they find is small quantities of cannabis for personal use. It's not random stop and search is not an effective way of dealing with knife crime and gun crime.
Francoise Jones, random stop and search, does that poison the relationship between the police and communities?
Most definitely. And as Diane said, you know, there is a place for stop and search, because what else do we have? We certainly don't want to go back to sus. And the problem is that there's racial profiling going on with regards to young black men. And, you know, that needs to be dealt with. And I don't like the trend that I seem to be seeing now around handcuffing black men before you've even told them why you want to talk to them. Because at the end of the day, if stop and search is used correctly, then we shouldn't be stopping people who are not committing crime.
And Francine, on that point of the use of restraints, I mean, I saw a figure released by the Metropolitan Police over the summer that black people are 4 times more likely to be restrained by police than their white counterparts. What is your explanation for that?
I think that, from my experience of working in the police service, that certain people from certain groups get stereotyped. And when a police officer who has a racial bias sees a black man, the first thing that comes into his head is that I'm going to have to handle this in a certain way. And it's usually more use of force than they would normally use on anybody else.
So, Dr. Callender, how do we unpick that? What points do we start from?
Oh, well, that's a big question. I think we already know what the issues are. And once we know what the issues are, then we can work towards solutions. We know that there's a disproportionality in relation to stop and search with young black men. So we have to look at what are the triggers that might make a police officer stop a young black man. And I think it's a process of education. You know, not every young black man you see out there in a hoodie and wearing trainers is up to no good. You know, there's very many professional black men who dress like that. They similarly get stopped. And I think we do need to kind of support our colleagues to have a better racial literacy, a better understanding about race, a better understanding of their biases, so that they can work on those and think about how those biases impact the way in which they interface with black communities.
Diane Abbott, have the police made progress in recent years since the days of the release of the McPherson report? What progress have you seen on the ground? What are your constituents telling you?
Well, I think the police are more likely to talk the talk about anti-racism and so on than they were when I first became an MP 30-odd years ago. But what my young constituents tell me in particular is what upsets them is the way the police talk to them. And I think there is still a long way to go. And just to add something to what one of the other people on the panel was saying, of course it's an issue about young men in hoodies, but frankly, if you're a black person, who doesn't know some perfectly respectable black man who happens to drive a nice car, who's found himself stopped by the police? I mean, the offence, they call it in America driving whilst black. From the mere fact you're driving a nice car, they just assume you must have got the money for it the wrong way.
Francine, how important is representation? I mean, do we need to see more police officers from particular communities serving those communities, going back to those communities as police officers. Is that crucial? Because if you think about the government's launch for this extra 20,000 police officers that they have promised, is that a golden opportunity for that to happen?
Yes, it is a golden opportunity for that to happen, but it's not. We seem to concentrate on the numbers. It's not about the numbers. It's about representation in ranks where you have influence to make a change. That's where we're missing. You can get as many police officers as you like in at the bottom end, but if they cannot get the opportunity to be in a position of influence, then nothing will ever change. We've only to history had one black chief constable ever. So why is that? And it seems like the higher up you go in the police service, the harder time you will have. And, you'll probably be the only person, the only one that looks like you at that level in not the big forces, but certainly the smaller forces outside of London and the big urban areas. It's about representation in the higher ranks. That's what's needed.
Dr. Callender, final thoughts?
Just to build on the previous point, I think it is about representation in the higher ranks, but it's also about representation in all areas, not just areas that serve our community, because young white children need to see people who do not look like them in positions of authority as well.
And Diane Abbott, as a serving Member of Parliament, if there was one lesson that we could all learn from the death of George Floyd, what do you think that lesson should be?
That it's really important that the police are trained properly and that we try and eradicate the undue use of force, because that's how situations like George Floyd happen. And we still see that black people are more likely to have violence used against them or be handcuffed by the police than other people.
OK, Diane Abbott, Member of Parliament, Francoise Jones and Dr. Christine Callender, many thanks indeed to the three of you for joining us this evening. Thank you. You're watching a Sky News special programme, Quincy Floyd and Neville Lawrence, the fight for justice. After the break, we'll be asking if the protests that have taken place in cities across the UK have made a difference to the lives of black people, and finding out what more needs to be done. Welcome back. You're watching a special programme, Quincy Floyd and Neville Lawrence, the fight for justice, part of our coverage of Black History Month on Sky News. In an exclusive interview today, George Floyd's son has told of the moment at his father's funeral when he told him he wouldn't let his death be in vain. Since the killing of George Floyd in May, Black Lives Matter protests have taken place around the world, with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets to demand justice. Sports stars from around the world have followed Colin Kaepernick's lead and publicly taken the knee. And statues like this one of slaver Edward Colston in Bristol have been torn down, with many others going to museums. Well, Black History Month is, of course, about education. And when the history books are written, 2020 could well be a pivotal year. But how much has really changed and what still needs to be done? Well, joining me to discuss that is Catherine Ross, founder of Museum Monde, the first museum in the UK to celebrate Caribbean heritage, culture and social history. Dr. Jason Ardeh, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Durham University, and Hakim Adi, Professor of the History of Africa at the University of Chichester and the UK's first Black History Professor. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Catherine Ross, if I could firstly start with you. Do you think we're witnessing a seminal moment when it comes to our understanding of Black history here in the UK?
Most definitely. Yes, this is going to go down in history as perhaps the most significant Black History Month celebration and commemoration. Definitely. From its start, we've had to battle with COVID and all the issues that that's thrown up. Things like our housing, our jobs, things that have held us back or put us at a disadvantage started to come to the fore. Other people understood. We have been talking about it in our communities, but now everybody was able to hear about that. Then followed, just as we were dealing with that, we had the George Floyd murder, and that rocked everybody. So, yeah, it's going to be a difficult year, but good in the sense that Black Lives Matter has come to the fore, and perhaps it's not the right use of words, but leading the charge. It's helping people around the world to understand what we have been saying just within our own communities, or when we come out and knock on the doors of authorities, you know, they haven't really heard, they haven't opened the door fully to us. And so, yeah, we are going to make a difference.
Dr. Ade, 2020 has been quite a year for Britain's minority communities.
It has. Good evening, first and foremost, and thank you for having me. It has been a tumultuous year in many respects, but I guess before the kind of seminal events of the summer and the murder of George Floyd, we were in a direction where society has been kind of splintered and fractured because of issues around race and racism, and probably more pertinently, the interweaving of it within our institutions and how it structurally disadvantages people of colour in Britain and globally speaking. So we are in a seminal moment. I do think there is something about this particular course or moment in time that feels different. It's moved beyond, I think, the enforced period of reflection that came as a result of the lockdown has actually made people reconceptualise, one, what allyship may represent, and two, and more importantly, to really move racism from the periphery and the margins to the centre, and really prioritise that as a political and social issue.
And Professor Ade, briefly, what can you tell us about Black history, and also why is it so intrinsically linked to European history and culture?
What can I tell you? Well, as far as Britain is concerned, it's an extremely lengthy history, some 2,000 years, perhaps 3,000 years we're talking about. I think the difficulty is that that history in Britain has often been hidden or obscured. It's something which is not as well known about as it should be. People feel excluded from history. People feel that history has been distorted. I wouldn't say that this history is only related to European history. It's more that the history of Britain is related to the history of Africa, the history of the Caribbean, the history of other parts of the world. But often these connections between Britain and other parts of the world is obscured, is hidden, and therefore those who originate from other parts of the world, their history and their contribution to Britain's history is also obscured. As we know now, probably some of the first Britons were people of colour, to use a common expression. So even our conception of Britishness, our conception of Englishness, actually needs to be reconsidered. We need to look at history as it is, as it was. It's not simply a history of the white men of property. It's a history which should include everybody. And the importance of understanding that history is not just to understand the past, but to have some understanding of the present world, have an outlook on the present world that enables us to operate today, to look at the world, to understand the world, and hopefully to change it for the better.
So Catherine, this is fundamentally about equipping our young people with the knowledge of Black history, irrespective of the race of that young person.
Oh, most definitely. Whenever we do our work in schools, or when young people come to our exhibitions, it's young people of all different ethnicities, and they always say, we do this, or we use that, and then we find ways of connecting. And that's quite important for young people. They need to know they're part of something that's, you know, a whole, and something that's been going for a very long time. So history is now an exciting thing for young people. This Black Lives Matter has involved people of all different age groups and different ethnicities. So we're all learning together, we're all standing together, and I'm very confident that we're going to get some real sustainable change.
Dr. Ade, the argument goes what young people learn in the classroom fundamentally shapes the person that they become to be. From a sociologist's point of view, I'm wondering whether that knowledge will help to tackle some of the disparities and inequalities that exist in society, or is that too much of a simplistic argument?
I wouldn't say it's a simplistic argument, and I totally accept the right for people to reject that way of thinking. But I think importantly, education is a microcosm of society, and one of education's fundamental remits is to prepare people to take their place within society. And I think one of the more kind of personal things is this idea of the teaching of Black history is for Black people. Actually, the teaching of Black history is to the benefit of everyone. It's to the detriment of every single British citizen or global citizen to not have that history in trying to navigate and traverse a multicultural and multi-ethnic society. So for me, it becomes a fundamental part of that toolkit you need to actually traverse society and engage with people from different diasporas and different types of communities, populations, ethnicities, and etc.
And Dr. Ade, I guess when you speak to many people about Black history and where it begins, many will say it starts with the Windrush generation. We all know that is far from the truth. Is Britain duty-bound to change that narrative? Or is it up to the individual to educate themselves about that history?
Well, I would say it was both. Obviously, schools, universities, the media, those who have a possibility of educating others, we have that responsibility. At the same time, of course, individuals can read, can find out, can investigate these things themselves. But I think that the problem is that history is often presented in a distorted way. It's falsified in various ways, and that creates difficulties for people, especially for young people, but also for older people. It distorts our view of the world. It confuses us about the past as well as the present. So in some ways, we could say it's perhaps not surprising that the truth about the past isn't told, just as sometimes the truth about the present isn't told. We can all remember recent examples of government trying to change the type of history that's taught in schools, trying to exclude whole sections of the population from historical study and historical inquiry. So I think that it's not just there are reasons why history is not presented in its entirety, and it's sometimes said that those who are in power, as it were, that they attempt to shape the kind of history which is told and which is related to others. They try and condition the way that we see the world. So we all have a responsibility to try and enlighten ourselves, try and understand the world as it is, as it was. But of course, we call on those who are educators, schools, universities, the media, and so on, to do much more, and not do just much more in October, because having something called Black History Month in October shows us that there's a problem, for the other 11 months of the year, that this history is more or less hidden again. So what's important is that history is presented in a way that everybody can understand it for 12 months of the year. Everybody's included throughout the entire year. And as I say, we all have a responsibility to contribute to just telling the truth about the world.
Dr. Ade, I've heard some observers argue that we shouldn't be celebrating Black History Month because Black history is British history is Black history, and what you're doing potentially is separating the two, which could lead us all down a difficult and dangerous path. What would you say to those observers?
Say to those observers that I think there needs to be an engagement specifically in Black history, particularly because there's always been kind of a nostalgia for omitting Black history, for neutralising Black history and the contribution of Black people to British society. And I think one of the things that becomes really important is, the fact, we have St. George's Day, we have loads of different memorandums that kind of acknowledge and celebrate, parts of our history, and do it in really kind of secular ways in terms of, on one particular day it'll be this and on one particular day it'll be that. And I think you do need to have an acknowledgement of that contribution by Black British people. And I think it's not, I think it's a reductionist to kind of take the approach that, you're separating those two things. I think they're in many ways symbiotic, and it should be interwoven within British history, generally speaking. And as kind of Professor Addie said, it's really, really important that actually it becomes the norm rather than being kind of reduced to 1 month. And actually, that is the actual issue, that it's celebrated for effectively 30 to 31 days in a year, when actually it should be a 365-day kind of venture, in terms of it should be interwoven within our societal and kind of egalitarian vernacular, in terms of how we speak, how we talk, how we engage in these different discourses.
And Catherine Ross, when it comes to teaching Black history in schools, does it matter about who teaches it? Because if it does, I guess it raises many questions about representation. Or should it not matter? Fundamentally, it's about the fact that Black history is taught in schools, full stop.
Yeah, because if it's part of the curriculum, then the teachers have to deliver it. So it wouldn't really matter what ethnicity the teacher is. But obviously, if it's somebody who's of ethnic origin, as we would say, we can tell it's sweeter. That's a Caribbean expression. I mean, you can put more in it because it's something you're very familiar with and is part of your experience. But can I just go back to say that I think teaching young people starts in the home. We have to go back to that family responsibility. It's been great over the period of COVID when people are in lockdown and we're able to communicate and share a lot of important heritage information with their children. So I think we need to go back to that. But we do pay our taxes. So we do expect to hear more about Black heritage through the schools and in the museums and other established heritage places. They're as much ours, so they should be telling our story. And they should present it in a way that will be attractive and interesting, because they're perhaps telling the story to a group of people that haven't really been part of that culture for a while. So they have got to start thinking creatively and innovatively about that. I know a lot of museums are working. We've helped a lot of them with writing new labels to explain things that they've got on show that they didn't fully understand. So again, the community can assist heritage organisations with that, and we can support them in that. And
Dr. Addie, I don't know about you, but quite a lot in the past I've heard the phrase that this is a moment of racial reckoning. What do you understand that to mean?
Sure that I understand it to mean anything. Certainly this year there has been an upsurge in people's opposition to racism and Eurocentrism in all its forms. And that's very much to be welcomed. I mean, it's perhaps an unprecedented upsurge. People showing that they're fed up, you could say, with the way that the powers that be operate in this society as well as in societies throughout the world. But that doesn't necessarily change anything. I think it's up to us to continue those struggles that have been going on for many years, for many centuries. For example, we've seen the government's comments recently on this whole question of the glorification of those who committed crimes against humanity. The government is intent on glorifying those who've committed crimes, whereas the vast majority of people in this country, it seems, want to remove that glorification, want to end that glorification. So that is a way in which history is presented in different ways, if you like, and I think even the government accepts that there are different views, different approaches to history. And so the question is, what kind of society do we want? What kind of history do we want? And who should decide? How can we actually become the decision makers about what we learn and what goes on in society, whether there is racism, whether there is discrimination, whether there is a Windrush scandal and so on. These are things which are perpetrated, as it were, by the powers that be. And what this year has shown is that the majority of people don't want this kind of society. They want change. But then it's up to the majority of us who want that change to do something about it.
Dr. Ade, just very briefly, if there was one aspect of Black British history that you'd want to focus on, specialise on, what would it be?
Great question. I guess the contribution of Black British people to building a country. There's not one thing in particular, but I guess, the Windrush generation and their contribution to British society over a sustained period of 70 years, I think that needs to be celebrated more. And I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge the roots that those individuals have planted for, many Britons of colour to be able to reside in, I guess, a fair and equal society, or at least that's the wish. And there's still a lot of work to be done with regards to that. And I think that, for me, is really the hallmark of that. When I think of Black British history, I think of that as a really seminal kind of moment in that history, and a generation of people that have really built this country in a way that, has never really been respected or acknowledged.
Dr. Jason Ade, Professor Hakim Adi and Catherine Ross, fascinating discussion. Many thanks indeed for your time. Thank you. And Quincy Floyd and Neville Lawrence's conversation forms the basis of the latest episode of the Black History Month Sky News Daily podcast, which will run throughout October. You can listen on the Sky News website, Apple and Google Podcasts, and on Spotify. And for more stories on Black History Month, visit the dedicated section of the Sky News website and app at www.skynews.com/Black History Month.